Welcome back. In the last video I fully completed the roof of my garden room, and in this video I'll install the windows and doors. But before we get to that, we'll rewind the clock and discuss this Tyvek house wrap by first getting the window and door openings ready. Now onto the breathable membrane. This is actually the fourth type of membrane we've encountered in this series. To recap, the first was the damp-proof membrane, briefly mentioned in part 4, which is usually used under concrete slabs to stop moisture from soaking up from the ground below. The second was the damp-proof course, which is used in the first few layers of bricks in a house build, but I also used between my block piers and my floor joists. I actually used DPC at this stage too, as I designed my foundations so the blocks protruded slightly from the underside of the building. If water ran down the walls, it could hit those blocks and soak under the joists, causing rot, so I stapled pieces of DPC to the walls and overlapping the blocks so any rainwater will flow right over them instead. The third is a vapour barrier, which is used on the inside of the insulation and stops moisture inside the building moving into the walls. And now the fourth, the breathable membrane, which is used on the outside of a timber building and has two functions. One, as the name suggests, it's breathable, so any moisture that does get into the walls can escape out of the building. And two, it's waterproof, so stops any rainwater externally from soaking into the walls. I guess you could say it works a bit like an anorak or cagoule, and the structure of it is actually really interesting. In case you're wondering, the EPDM rubber roof I installed in the last video is also breathable. There are a few brands of breathable membrane on the market, but Tyvek from DuPont is certainly the most well regarded, even if it is on the pricey side. It's not too easy to find in the UK, but I managed to find mine at Jewson's, but other specialist online stores do stock it. The bottom roll is added first, and the top roll should then overlap by at least 6 inches to allow water to run over it. I started from one corner of the building and used 3 staples at the top corner so that the roll could pivot, and then I unfurled the roll before stapling at the top of the other side of the wall. Then I could go back and staple around the top, bottom, openings, and a few in the middle to keep it in place. I don't think there's any real formula to how many staples you use, just use common sense and what feels right, but it should end up tight to the building. Unless you have a very large door opening, it's best just to continue the Tyvek over any openings and cut them out later on. For the top roll, if you've gone down the route of having sloped joists like mine, then there may be a small amount of slack in the Tyvek due to the change in angle. Just gather it in one place, fold it over and staple in place. Next I needed to tape over where the two sheets overlap. I'm a little bit skeptical whether a cheaper non-branded tape would be just as good, but I went for the real stuff, which again isn't cheap, but I saved on some tape by not taping over the openings as I'm about to cut them out. A quick note, the Tyvek house wrap is only supposed to be exposed for up to 4 months before the cladding goes on, but I think that's designed for the strong Californian sunshine, and I've left mine for much longer, and you'll know when it's time to get the cladding on when the red writing starts to fade. So cutting out the windows and doors. You've probably seen on other videos this method of cutting a top flap into the Tyvek, but this is designed for American style windows, which have a flange around the outside. Our windows in the UK are usually fastened into the brick through the sides of the windows, so I had to come up with a way of cutting the Tyvek that suits our style of windows, and this is how I did it. Now onto the windows and doors. Originally I'd intended on getting them second hand and spraying the white UPVC grey, but as my garden room came along, I felt it deserved better. I'd have loved to go for aluminium, but budget constraints meant that I'd be getting UPVC instead. I found a company online called Modern UPVC Windows, which again had great reviews and allows you to select the size down to the millimetre, remembering to leave at least 5mm spacing around the sides and top, as well as the ability to choose many other options. In case you want to emulate what I did, here's a quick look at what I selected. I spent just over $2,000 on the lot, which I thought wasn't too bad, given what some companies try to charge. The sills come 10cm oversized, so first up is to decide whether to have the sill straight, like this, or rebated. I chose a rebate as I thought it would make a nice feature, but I discovered it really helps keep the window in position, preventing it from moving backwards in the timber frame, and keeps all the windows and doors uniform. To work out how deep to cut the rebate will depend on your style preference and what you'll clad the walls with. I wanted my sills to only protrude slightly from the cladding, so I factored in the timber battens and cladding and decided on a 6.5cm width rebate. I attached the sill caps with the same mitre bond I used in the last video. I could then mark where to cut the rebates, 5cm in from the sides and 6.5cm in from the outer edge. Next I use packers in the gaps around the window to keep it in place. The trick is not to make it too tight so as to bend the window or door out of shape, but tight enough so they don't fall out. The number of packers you use will depend on the size of your windows, but I use 2 at the top and 3 on each side for this window. The packers should be roughly 15cm away from the corners, and you can of course combine the packers to fit the gaps. For the next stages I got 3 new tools. I then set about removing the beading. It's actually better to remove these before putting the window in place, but when removing them it's important to lay them out so that you know exactly which ones came from where, so I laid them out neatly on the floor. I started by fastening the bottom of the frame. I drilled the right size hole, then applied some sealant to stop any water getting in, before driving the Specialized screw that came with the windows. I used 2 screws for the bottom. From there I moved the window into plumb and marked plumb with a Sharpie on the sides, so I could see if the window moved during fixing. I could then fix the sides and top. You can either screw through the packers or next to them. I think I prefer the latter, but on this window I fixed through the packers. Now I could put the glass in. My windows came with special packers which have grooves that match those of the window frames. The number you use will depend on the size of the window, but a minimum of 1 each side. My glass had a specific inner and outer side, so make sure you're putting them in the right way round. Once in, I could add my normal packers to get the glass nice and snug. Now for windows and of course doors that open. You have to place the packers in a method called toe and heeling. 2 packers at the top on the handle side, and 2 packers at the bottom on the hinge side. This stops the window from sagging over time and causing problems with opening it. And the concept won't be new to you. If you look at a wooden gate, it's braced in much the same way, from top of the opening side to bottom of the hinge side. To get the beading back in place, I sprayed some window cleaner to help lubricate, and then hammered them back in. Always start with the shorter ones, as these are the most difficult to get in, and after the first one is done, do the opposite side before doing the other 2. I then broke off the packers protruding from the window. I actually think it's better to do this later on, once they are held more firmly in place with the spray foam, which I'll come to in a minute. I then moved on to the other windows and the doors. For the bigger patio-style door, I enlisted my girlfriend's help, but it proved too heavy to lift onto the sill, and it didn't help that our hands were half frozen, of course. Instead, we attached the sill to the frame using smaller screws underneath so it could move as one. This is a pretty common way to install windows, but I think I prefer the other method, as you can adjust the window and door once in place to keep an even gap on all sides. Still, needs must. Once all were in, they were looking good. Off camera, I installed the door handles and added the trickle vents for ventilation. If you've come this far, you'll find both very straightforward. I also added PIR insulation between the joists on the front and the back of the garden room, and now I can move on to the spray foam. Now, if you remember, I showed 2 options for framing the corners, but if you've done yours like mine, there are gaps between the blocking which need filling. I didn't do it when raising the walls because I didn't have the right size insulation to hand, so to remedy this, I drilled a hole wide enough to fit the nozzle of my foam gun and then filled them that way. Back to the windows and doors, the foam had expanded about 3/4 of the way through, so I came back and filled the rest from the outside. Once it had all fully expanded and dried, I could cut off the excess. Off camera, on the outside, I used silicone to seal around the windows and doors for extra air tightness and to stop any bugs digging into the spray foam. And finally, I could pull off the plastic protectors for the big reveal. A few quick notes. If the doors aren't lining up properly, then you can adjust with an Allen key, And do remember, if you need building regs for your garden room, you'll need yours signed off. The last thing to say is that installing windows and doors is a profession in itself, and this was my first go, so if you are a professional, go easy on me. So what else is new? Well, that job I mentioned I was looking for, I started in January, and it's home-based, which suits me perfectly. So it looks like I'll be setting up an office space in my garden room eventually. The discount for Rubber for Roofs is now available, and about 30 of you have already taken advantage. I've also managed to get you guys a discount at Fascia Expert, which is where my fascias came from, and they also supply UPVC soffits, guttering and cladding. The code for that should be ready shortly. Both codes will probably change regularly, so only email when you're about to order and I'll shoot the code across to you. Both are ongoing, but of course if anything changes I'll update the description or pin a comment. Lastly, I've been building a website to go along with this channel and series, and plan to go into more depth on each of the video's topics. It's still in development, but take a look around and see what you think. Part of the reason for building the website is to showcase your builds, and I've seen so many good ones coming along already. So take lots of photos and send them in once finished. So what's next? Well, I'll briefly cover how I framed my shower room, and we'll get stuck into the electrics and other things. See you then, everyone.